Uruk, was it really the world's first city? For more than a century, the answer seemed obvious. More than 5,000 years ago, on the plains of southern Mesopotamia, Uruk grew to a scale unprecedented in the region, and perhaps anywhere in the world at the time. Then archaeologists hundreds of kilometers to the north uncovered evidence that made the story far more complicated. Because before we decide which city came first, we need to answer a harder question. What exactly is a city? People had been living in large permanent settlements for thousands of years before Uruk. Jericho was already an extraordinary community long before 1700 BC. And Çatalhöyük, in what is now Turkey, brought thousands of people together in an exceptionally dense settlement centuries before the rise of Mesopotamian cities. So age alone cannot settle the argument. Neither can size. A city is not simply a village with more houses. Something deeper has changed. People begin to depend on specialists they may never know personally. Food and raw materials flow into a center. Crafts become full-time occupations. Institutions organize labor, storage, ritual and exchange. Public buildings require planning beyond the household. Large numbers of strangers must cooperate, compete and somehow live together. A settlement becomes not merely larger but more complex. And if those are the clues we are looking for, Uruk becomes extraordinary. Today, the ruins of Uruk lie in a dry landscape in southern Iraq. But the world in which the city developed looked very different. 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, the lower Tigris and Euphrates formed a shifting landscape of rivers, channels, and freshwater marshes. The Persian Gulf extended much farther inland than it does today. Uruk belonged to a world of water. Boats could move people and goods along channels. Marshes supplied fish and reeds. Agricultural land supported growing communities. Mud, available almost everywhere, became the basic material for houses, walls, and monumental buildings. And Uruk did not appear from nowhere. For generations, communities across southern Mesopotamia had been growing larger, more connected, and more organized. Farmers produced surpluses. Herds were managed. Waterways were controlled. Settlements exchanged goods and ideas. Then, during the 4th millennium BC, something accelerated. Uruk grew. And it kept growing. By around 3200 BC, Uruk covered roughly 250 hectares, close to a square mile. It was the largest known settlement in southern Mesopotamia and possibly the largest in the world at the time. But the number alone hides what that meant. Imagine approaching the city. Instead of a compact village surrounded by fields, you encounter an urban landscape extending across an enormous area. Monumental mud brick buildings dominate parts of the settlement. Some walls are decorated with mosaics made from thousands of colored clay cones. Workshops produce specialized goods. Metalworkers, potters, and other craftspeople operate within an economy that reaches far beyond individual households. Materials arrive from regions well beyond the southern plain. And the city concentrates people, labor, wealth, and authority on a scale that would have been difficult to imagine only centuries earlier. The monumental buildings are especially important. They were not simply larger houses. Whatever their exact religious, political, and economic functions, they required collective organization. Somebody had to plan them. Somebody had to obtain the materials. Somebody had to mobilize labor. And somebody had to feed and coordinate the people doing the work. Architecture had become evidence of institutions. That is one reason Uruk became the textbook candidate for the world's first city. But becoming large creates another problem. How do you keep a city alive? A household can remember who owes grain to whom. A small village can rely heavily on personal relationships. But what happens when thousands of people depend on food they did not grow, goods they did not make, and administrators they may never meet? Grain has to be collected, stored, and redistributed. Workers have to be organized. Livestock and raw materials have to be counted. Specialists have to be supplied. And somebody has to know what entered a storehouse yesterday and what left it today. The archaeological evidence gives us glimpses of an increasingly specialized society. One of the earliest written lists from Uruk contains around 120 official titles and occupational categories. We cannot translate every title with certainty, but the list reflects a world in which social and economic roles were becoming remarkably differentiated. Think about what that means. A person's place in society could increasingly be defined by a task that existed because thousands of other people were doing different tasks. A potter no longer had to produce all of his own food. An administrator could spend his working life managing resources instead of harvesting them. A specialist could become highly skilled because a larger system supplied what that household could not produce alone. And the larger system, in turn, depended on those specialists. That dependence is one of the defining features of urban life. It creates opportunity. A city can support crafts, institutions, and monumental projects no village could sustain. But it also creates vulnerability. If storage fails, if transport breaks down, or if administration collapses, the effects can spread through a population whose members are increasingly dependent on one another. The real revolution at Uruk may not have been the buildings. It may have been organization. And once society becomes this complicated, it creates a new problem. Information. During the late 4th millennium BC, clay tablets at Uruk began to carry numerical and pictorial signs used to record economic information. Grain. Animals. Containers. Rations. Labor. Some of humanity's earliest surviving written records are not poems or royal proclamations. They are accounts. Who received what? How much barley was distributed? What goods were stored? How many workers had to be supplied? This is easy to overlook because we tend to think of writing as literature. But in its earliest surviving Mesopotamian form, writing is deeply connected to administration. At first, many signs were numerical or pictorial. Over time, scribes changed how marks were made and how signs could represent language. These systems eventually developed into cuneiform, a writing tradition that would survive in the Near East for more than 3,000 years. That transformation was enormous. Information no longer had to disappear when the person who remembered it died or left. A transaction could be recorded. A ration could be checked. An obligation could outlive the conversation that created it. In a city where relationships increasingly extended beyond face-to-face memory, that ability was revolutionary. But we should be careful. Uruk did not suddenly invent writing in a single moment. Systems for counting, sealing, and recording information had a much longer history. The earliest tablets from Uruk preserve only one part of a more complicated development. Still, the connection is striking. Larger communities created more transactions. More transactions created more information. And more information demanded new ways to record it. The city was not only transforming where people lived. It was transforming how knowledge could be stored outside the human mind. And Uruk's world extended far beyond its own streets. During the later 4th millennium BC, objects, building styles, and administrative practices associated with southern Mesopotamia appeared across a vast region, through parts of Iran, northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia. Archaeologists often call this the Uruk Expansion. But that phrase can be misleading if it makes us imagine a single empire simply conquering everything around it. The evidence is much more varied. Different regions show trade, migration, local imitation, exchange, and communities combining Uruk-style practices with their own traditions. What matters for our story is the scale of the connection. A city like Uruk required things from beyond itself. Materials, food, labor, trade partners, information. Some resources available to Mesopotamian communities had to come from far beyond the alluvial plain. That meant movement, negotiation, and exchange across long distances. Every imported material connected the city to people who lived outside its walls, and every connection made the urban economy more complex. This is one of the paradoxes of the first cities. The more concentrated human life became in one place, the more that place depended on a much wider world. A large city creates networks because it needs them. But those same networks also make a large city possible. And at this point, the case for Uruk seems almost complete. Huge scale, monumental architecture, specialized labor, administration, early writing, long-distance connections. If any settlement deserves to be called the world's first city, this seems to be it. But more than 700 kilometers to the north, there was a problem. Tell Brak. In what is now northeastern Syria, archaeologists uncovered a pattern of settlement that did not fit the old story. For much of the 20th century, one influential model of Mesopotamian urban origins was relatively simple. Large cities developed first in the irrigated south. Then urban civilization spread outward. Tell Brak made that sequence harder to defend. Surveys around the site showed that urban growth there was already taking shape during the late 5th and early 4th millennia BC. And Brak did not simply grow as one compact settlement expanding from a single center. Instead, separate clusters of occupation appear to have developed around one another and gradually coalesced. Eventually, the settlement reached roughly 130 hectares. Smaller than Uruk at its late 4th millennium peak. But the timing is what matters. Brak's urban growth began before Uruk reached its extraordinary scale, and before the great wave of southern influence usually associated with the Uruk Expansion. There is another important difference. The northern environment did not depend on the same kind of irrigation system that shaped the cities of southern Mesopotamia. In other words, communities at Tell Brak may have reached urban life by a different route. That does not make Uruk unimportant. And it does not mean Tell Brak simply replaces Uruk as the new winner. The evidence from the two sites is different. Their environments were different. Their development was different. Archaeological preservation is uneven. Even the word city can hide differences between settlements that may have organized power, labor, and neighborhoods in very different ways. So archaeology cannot give us a simple scoreboard. It can only show us that the transition to urban life was more diverse than the old model allowed. This is not a race with a clean finish line. What Tell Brak changed was the model. Uruk may not have held a monopoly on the beginning of urban life. And that raises a more interesting possibility. What if the city was not invented once? What if urban life emerged through different experiments in different places? Consider the evidence. Jericho was vastly older than Uruk and had substantial communal construction at an astonishingly early date. Çatalhöyük brought large numbers of people into an exceptionally dense Neolithic settlement. Tell Brak developed into a major northern center through a pattern unlike the cities of southern Mesopotamia. And Uruk eventually combined scale, administration, monumentality, specialized labor, and information management in a form that was extraordinary for its time. So which one was first? That depends partly on what we mean by city. Population? Area? Monumental architecture? Centralized institutions? Economic specialization? Writing? No single criterion gives us a perfect answer. And perhaps the real problem is the word first. It makes us imagine a starting line. A precise moment when one settlement suddenly becomes a city while every other settlement remains a village. But archaeology rarely gives us boundaries that clean. The rise of cities was not like the invention of a single tool on a single afternoon. It was a transformation. Different communities experimented with larger settlements, new forms of organization, and new relationships between people, food, labor, information, and power. Some experiments disappeared. Others endured. And in southern Mesopotamia, Uruk took the experiment further than anything we can clearly see before it. So, was Uruk really the world's first city? We cannot say that with certainty. Tell Brak gives us strong evidence for a very early northern path to urbanism. Much older large settlements make the definition more complicated still. But removing the word first does not make Uruk less important. By the late 4th millennium BC, Uruk had become something exceptional. A settlement covering roughly 250 hectares. A society capable of organizing monumental construction. An economy supporting specialized labor. Institutions managing goods and workers. Administrative systems closely connected to the development of writing. And networks reaching far beyond the city itself. Uruk may not have invented urban life, but it showed how far urban life could go. And perhaps that is the more important story. Because once thousands of strangers could live, work, trade and organize themselves in one place, something fundamental had changed. Human beings had created a new kind of environment. One built not only from mud, brick and waterways, but from institutions, information and dependence on people they would never know personally. That experiment did not end at Uruk. We are still living inside it. If you want to keep exploring the ancient world with us, subscribe to The Past Breathes and continue with the next story on screen.